Okay, academic writing people, this is another video, this time to help you understand the last topic of our partial exam, which is managing the incomplete thesis statements. The incomplete thesis statements. So, in order to understand incomplete thesis statements, we're going to go to first our manual on page 8. On page 8 of the manual, you see, no, not this one. You see this. Thesis statement templates. We're going to categorize our thesis statements first into two different categories, which would be the although category and the however category. All right. Well, the although category includes although, which we see right here, even though, and the alternative though. And as you probably understand, they are grammatically synonyms. The second category of thesis statement would be the however category. Well, just like although, it's not just however, it's however, nevertheless, and nonetheless. So basically, on this page, we have 4 different templates, but with only 2 different styles. The first 2 are thesis statement models or templates in the although style, and the second 2 are thesis statement templates in the however style. For simplicity's sake, we're going to be working with only those 2 styles for these exercises. What we've got here and what we see in all of the thesis statements that we use in the academic writing class is that they will always express 2 sides of a topic. Here we can introduce 2 opposite side ideas. I'm going to improvise a little bit here. Even though there has been much resistance to efforts to decrease carbon transmissions, there are even better reasons to promote these kinds of measures. So we've got this idea of decreasing carbon transmissions, and it's supposed that for a topic like this, there are always going to be 2 different sides, and it might be very easy to see one side and express that one side, for example with this topic, but it might require a little bit more imagination to perceive that there's probably resistance to any kind of measure that we want to implement. If there were not resistance to these measures, then they would all be laws. Each one of these templates gives you the opportunity to express, on the one hand, the first half, an opposite or one point of view, and on the second half, a point of view where it's going to be apparent that that you prefer the second half. With each one of these contrast ideas, even though and although, or if you use the alternative, nevertheless and however, we're always going to be expressing one side, which would be the opposite side, and then the second would be the side that we really want to support. So whatever you say second is the side that has more emphasis. That's the side for which it's understood, oh, okay, that's the author's argument. So the second side is always when the author's argument comes in. It's always going to be that way. where the first side is, you mention a side of a topic, and the second side, when you use this language, sounds like there's more emphasis, or that's the posture or the stance that the author really has. And that's just the way that these contrast words work. They do not create a balance like different contrast words. It's very clear that the second side of the thesis statement is always the author's argument. So it's really important to understand that whatever comes on the second side of the thesis statement with these styles is the author's argument. So let's take a look at some thesis statements from the manual. If you go to pages 6, 7, and 8, you can see some of these pre-approved topics, and these are the topics that we're going to be working with for our papers that we begin in second partial. For simplicity's sake, almost every one of these begins with an although or an even though. You can see some exceptions. For example, here in number 1, we begin with it must be admitted that. And number 5, it is true that. Let's see how many different styles are here on this paper. Okay, so for number 1, we express one side, and this basically says people believe that they have the right to eat whatever they want. Okay, and then we've got the contrast word nevertheless, and the author's argument, which is that there should be new regulations for fast food. Okay, so here's a contrast word, and if you read it, you can see that the second half is what the author really believes. Now, a good exercise to get familiar with these thesis statements would be for to do, take 10 of these thesis statements and change them to the opposite style. So that means that for number 1, we could say the same thing with although. And it's actually very easy. Although there are numerous arguments supporting a person's right to eat whatever he wants, restaurants should be able to sell whatever the customers desire. And then you take out nevertheless, because you're never going to use two contrast words. Although, you state the opposite side, and then comma, and the rest is the same. Let's try that again. Although there are numerous arguments supporting a person's right to eat whatever he wants, and restaurants should be able to sell whatever the customers desire. No semicolon, use a comma. Take out this word, comma. There are better arguments that support the implementation of new regulations in the production, labeling, and sale of fast food. So what does number 2 say? Well, we're going to have an opposite side, and then the second half is going to be the author's argument after this comma here. Although politics may in some cases favor strict trade and travel restrictions toward Cuba, comma, the United States should reject that policy and move rapidly toward normalizing diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. Let's try the same thing. Let's use the other style. We can say it must be admitted that. It must be admitted that in some cases politics may favor strict trade and travel restrictions toward Cuba. Semicolon here. However, comma, the United States should reject that policy and move rapidly toward normalizing diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba. Let's go back to those templates, and we're going to see that the punctuation is really important. And this is probably the most important thing when we are checking these two different styles of thesis statements. Whenever you have even though, or although at the beginning, you express one side, and then you only have a comma in the middle, and then you express the author's real argument. Notice there's only a comma in the middle, and then you finish with the author's real argument. Comma in the middle, and then the author's real argument. That's the same for all of these thesis statements that you find in the manual. Whenever it has although or even though at the beginning, or though, you express one side and then a comma in the middle, and then the second side is the author's real argument. Now, when you use the other style of contrast word, nevertheless, however, or nonetheless, that's not true. The punctuation is different. You express one side, and then you have the semicolon, the one you call in Spanish punto coma, semicolon, the contrast word, comma, and then you express the opposites, or then you express the author's true argument. Express one side, semicolon, contrast word, comma, and then the author's true argument. Oops, I went the wrong way. Let's go back to these. We can take any of them, but we need one that begins with, that has however. This one has nevertheless. This one applies. So the opposite side argument is, in this case, it may be true that the fishing industry has strong arguments as to why fishing should remain mostly unregulated. Semicolon, contrast word, nevertheless, however, or nonetheless, comma, and now you have the author's real argument. Further research will reveal that measures to reduce overfishing must be enforced. Here's another one. This one's about pit bulls. Opposite side argument. It must be admitted that there have been some instances of attacks on humans by pit bulls. Semicolon, contrast word, nevertheless, however, or nonetheless, comma, and here's the author's real argument. Most experts and families accept and agree that pit bulls, when properly raised and handled, can make great pets. So let's go to the activity. What are you going to see on the exam? Well, you're going to see some incomplete thesis statements. And where are they? Let me pause for just a moment. Here they are, incomplete thesis statements. So imagine that on an exam, you see only one half of several thesis statements. So this is a thesis statement, but it's only one half. This is another thesis statement, but it's only one half. This is another one, this is another one, and this is another one. So the first thing we have to do is determine which half of the thesis statement we're working with. And it's actually very simple. You just pay attention to the punctuation and capitalization. We've got some dots here that help us understand. There's an extra dot. And it's supposed to be 3. All right. So we've got information omitted here, and then a semicolon, a contrast word, and then a comma. So this must be the second half of a thesis statement. All right, and I see the same thing down here. Dot dot dot. Going back to the first one. Oh, we've got a period that indicates the end of the sentence as well. So that's obviously the second half of a sentence. Go down here. This is also the second half of a sentence. Dot dot dot. And here's a period. This can only be the however, nevertheless, or nonetheless style. Well, we have nevertheless there, so we know it's that style. In this one, we don't have the contrast word. Why? Because it's supposed that you know that it's supposed that you can complete this idea, but you have to use a contrast word in the correct position. Let's look at the second and third ones. All right. In the first one, we've got the other style, which is the even though style. So this is going to be the opposite side idea, and then after the comma, we're missing the second half of the sentence. We have to imagine what the author's real argument's going to be. In number 1, we have to imagine what the opposite side argument would be. In number 3, we have the first half of the argument, and we're missing the second half of the argument, which is what the author really believes. In this one, we're missing the first half of the argument, but we see what the author really believes. And in the last one, we're missing the second half of the argument. We don't see what the author really believes. But it's important to pay attention to the semicolon here, because that means we only have one option for the contrast word. Here we already have the contrast word. When we rewrite this thesis statement, we're going to write the first half of this thesis statement, and we don't need a contrast word because it's already there. In number 2, when we rewrite this one, we need a contrast word, and there's a comma here, so that means that, well, we already have the contrast word, I'm sorry. It's the other style. So we already have the contrast word, we already have the contrast word. Here we don't have the contrast word, but the punctuation indicates that we have to use however, nevertheless, or nonetheless. The same thing is happening in the last one. We have to use however, nevertheless, or nonetheless. This one, the fourth one, is different. There's no punctuation that indicates to us that we definitely have to use one contrast word or the other one. This thesis statement can be completed using either style. You could begin with although and express the opposite side, or and a comma, sorry, although, opposite side, comma, and finish with this. Or express the opposite side argument, put a semicolon, have however, nevertheless, or nonetheless, and then a comma, and you finish your sentence. So if you see one like this on the exam, you can use either style. If you see a semicolon, you have to use the however, nevertheless, or nonetheless style. If you see even though or although at the beginning, well, you cannot use however, nevertheless, or nonetheless in the middle. It's one contrast word or the other, and you can never use both, and that's really important. Try it in Spanish. Try to form a sentence with aunque, because that's although, and no obstante, or sin embargo. You would never have one sentence that has both of those words, aunque, and then later, sin embargo. Okay, it's one or the other. So, aunque is although, though, or even though, and nevertheless is sin embargo or no obstante. Nevertheless, nonetheless, or nonetheless. The challenge with these thesis statements is to imagine what would be the opposite side argument. What's missing? Well, here in number 1, the idea is that this person believes that doing research on fetal tissue, which is, I think in Spanish you say, célula madre. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's it. So using cells from the mother in the laboratory is going to be good for society, and we should approve that kind of program or research. So this guy says that we should fund or promote that kind of research. So what's the opposite side argument? That we shouldn't fund that type of research? That's basically what you have to express in very general terms, that there are people that believe that this type of research should not be funded. Okay, so we go to the second one, And so this is the first half of the argument. This is not what the author's going to promote. And if you read it, you see that the writer suggests that some people believe that public schools in America are safe these days. Well, the opposite side argument, with just a little imagination, would be that that public schools really aren't so safe these days. Okay, that's in the news. We all know that that information is out there. So what's happening in this one? On the one hand, some people think that cloning should be illegal and immoral. So what would the other side of the argument be? Perhaps that it should be promoted or it should be funded, similar to number one, that money should be invested in this type of research. I think that would be the author's argument, and it's pretty easy to predict what's coming next, and that's what you have to do. You have to try to imagine yourself as a student writer using this style. What are the two sides of the argument? Here in number 4, it looks like in the author's argument, he stresses that there should be education programs in prisons. So what's the opposite side argument? That there shouldn't be education programs in prisons. And you express that in general terms, and you don't try to explain why. You just express that in general terms. So the last one, students always ask, well, what is eugenics, or what are eugenics? Eugenics is a form of genetic modification. It's supposed that in programs of eugenics that the government requires humans to follow certain rules before reproducing, and that the government would apply laboratory tests to determine a human's genetic makeup, and basically force people to reproduce in a way that would supposedly be beneficial to the human race in terms of genetics. So we can improve the human race if we follow certain rules with respect to genetics. Okay, so here's the opposite side argument, that many people believe eugenics is unethical. Well, the argument that the author is probably going to make is that there are actually decent arguments as to why eugenics should be promoted or funded or invested in. Okay, so that's the breakdown of the analysis. You have to analyze these ideas very carefully. The good thing is, on the exam, your ideas are going to be a little bit simpler. You should pause the video here. If you were not able to do these thesis statements in class, you should pause the video here and write out the other half to each one of these thesis statements, following all of the rules of punctuation and never using more than one contrast word at the same time. So pause the video and write the other half of these thesis statements, and then I will show you at the end of the video suggestions for possible answers for this activity. Pause your video. Okay, so we're back, and here are some suggestions for how to complete those thesis statements. The part in red is, let me see. The part in red is the part that you wrote. Okay. You'll see that we're following all of the rules with respect to punctuation. For example, every time you use a nevertheless, however, or nonetheless in the middle, it's always preceded by the semicolon, and it's always followed by a comma, and you never use although, though, or even though with this style. On the other side, when you have even though, or although at the beginning, you only have a comma in the middle, and you never use a second contrast word. It's one style or the other. Here we've got one with however. We've got the semicolon, the contrast word, and a comma. Here we've got one with even though, and we've got only a comma in the middle. Here we've got one with however, and there's the semicolon here, and the contrast word, and then a comma. So that's what you have to know how to do for the exam. Let me pause the video for a moment, and I can give you some more practice thesis statements. So I'm back. If you want to practice this more, you can take a look at any of these incomplete thesis statements. Obviously, you can pause the video. Here we have 4 half thesis statements. Here we have 4 more. And here we have 2 more. Some of these I think we've already seen, so it's a little bit repetitive, and excuse me for that oversight. That's what you have to do in order to master the incomplete thesis statements. Good luck.